Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe good evening. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and Director of External Relations for the Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network. Welcome to the Foundation's Without Justice, Can There Be a Victory or an Enduring Peace? Today's virtual summit. This is a follow-on to the in-person and virtual summit we had in the U.S. Capitol last December. Events demand continuing attention and genuine support from Washington, all of which will be discussed in today's program. We are honored and so thankful for the exceptional panelists we have presenting today, and it's really time to begin. I do want to note that during the panel discussions, if the audience has questions, there's a place at the bottom of the screen for chats or questions. However, please know your questions may not be addressed only because the panels may not have time. If you do have a question that's not taken care of, you can send an email to me. Try and write this down, it's fairly straightforward. Robert@robertamcconnell.com. The A is a middle initial and there's no punctuation. Robert@robertamcconnell.com, and I will try and have it answered in the next few days. Our first speaker is Congressman Marcy Kaptur of Ohio. Marcy is a true friend of the Foundation and certainly a true friend of Ukraine. Marcy is the longest-serving woman in the history of the House of Representatives and is both an extraordinary representative for her constituents back in Ohio, but a powerful voice for American national security interests, including Ukraine. Marcy was the founder of the bipartisan Congressional Ukraine Caucus and has been its co-chairman ever since. It was founded years ago. This afternoon, Marcy will be back on Capitol Hill, but this morning she will be speaking to us from her district office in Toledo, Ohio. Marcy?
Thank you so very much, Bob. I would certainly like to thank the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and you, Nadia McConnell, for your extraordinary leadership and for hosting this important summit at such a critical time. Your amazing organization is one in which I've had the privilege to work with over many, many decades to support the aspirations of the people of Ukraine to be free. It has been an honor. Just over a week ago, on February 24th, the world community recognized the solemn second anniversary of Putin's brutal expansion of Russia's illegal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine that began in 2014. 2 years ago, Vladimir Putin drove his tanks right at the heart of Ukraine toward Kyiv. But unlike Russia's similar invasion of Hungary in 1956, those tanks never made it to Ukraine's capital. In 1956, they made it to Budapest. It was an extraordinary moment in world history. And for 2 years since, the world has witnessed a sovereign nation, the poorest in Europe, see its sovereign borders violated, and then fight for its precious liberty against the third largest military in the world. This is historic. It will be remembered for centuries to come. And we all support victory for Ukraine. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed or wounded, and half its people, millions and millions and millions of people, have been displaced. The civilians experience daily horrific bombings, and they choose to stay. And yet for 2 years, the Ukrainian people have been enduring and fighting valiantly to cast off the yoke of the third largest military in the world. Ukraine has regained half the land Russia had seized during invasion. Think about that. And what sacrifice. Over 40% of Russia's military capacity has been lost. And with the help of the free world, Ukraine has dealt body blow after body blow to the Russian army, navy, air force, and supply depots. The Ukrainian people's immense sacrifices over the last 2 years have inspired the world. When Putin attacked Ukraine, he attacked the entire freedom-loving world. Putin is waging a war against liberty and its institutions globally. Written in the halls of Congress is a quote from William Allen White. Quote, "Wherever a free man is in chains, we are threatened, and whoever is fighting for liberty is defending America." Our nation and our allies have a responsibility to stand with Ukraine in her time of greatest peril. Ukraine is the scrimmage line for a liberty struggle on the continent of Europe, and the world is watching. To recognize this important moment, the Congressional Ukraine Caucus introduced a new House resolution to commemorate this effort on the part of Ukraine and her people over the last 2 years. Importantly, Putin is not counting the number of rubles or Russian lives he is expending on this war. What he is counting are the number of votes for Ukraine that remain in the US Congress. He knows that America's support will decide the victor of this conflict, and so should we. I and our colleagues in the bipartisan Ukraine caucus, now numbering almost 100, if it isn't 100 yet, have called on the Speaker to immediately take up the urgent supplemental funding package that the US Senate agreed to on a vote of 70 to 29. Ukraine cannot wait any longer. Any further delay in supplies only results in more Ukrainian lives lost. And any time a vote has come up in the House of Representatives, Ukraine wins that vote by over 280, sometimes as many as 330 votes out of 435. So as we return to Congress this week, we hope that the Speaker will bring up the funding bill for support for Ukraine. Now is the moment for our nation and this institution to reaffirm our commitment to a foreign policy that promotes freedom, liberty, first, last, and always. As leaders of our free world, this country, the United States of America, must support those who are willing to fight and die for their own liberty around our world. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your leadership, U.S.-Ukraine Foundation.
Thank you, Marcy. Appreciate your time. I always enjoy hearing from you. I always enjoy knowing what you're doing on Capitol Hill constantly, and the caucus has grown because of you. And I hope that the Speaker will certainly listen to you. I mean, it's just as a longtime follower of Congress, it is so hard to understand why we can't get this thing to the floor. As you say, every moment that it's delayed, every moment that the administration doesn't have that money, lives are being lost, and children are being abducted, and rapes are occurring, and war crimes continue. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you for so much that you do. Have a safe trip back to Washington, and give them hell when you get here.
Thank you. And thank you to all those who have joined us.
Okay. The subject of Ukraine in NATO has been with us for a couple of decades, at least, and the attitudes of the people of Ukraine have evolved significantly. When Ukraine became independent, there was a hesitancy. Didn't know whether they wanted to be in NATO. There were various factors that had contributed to that. NATO was an alliance. There was a defensive alliance. It wasn't known how strong the people of Ukraine were for membership in NATO. And one of the things that I think is important to remember, and General Breedlove has made this in a couple of speeches, Putin talks about how the United States and NATO went out and recruited countries to join NATO. General Breedlove has described sitting in those meetings when he was Supreme Allied Commander And it was the countries who were petitioning to come to NATO. They were asking, they were pushing, they were desirous. And not all of them got in right when they said they wanted to be. There were certain things that needed to be done. But Putin has it backwards when he talks about recruiting for NATO. The recruiting comes from the countries petitioning to get into NATO. And over the time of independence and over the time of the 10-year war that Putin has subjected Ukraine to, the attitudes of the people of Ukraine have grown to where it is overwhelming that the people of Ukraine want to be a part of NATO, want to be in that organization. And our first panel, I'm a little bit ahead of time, our first panel, Ukraine and NATO, secures global security, is very timely given that next summer in Washington, D.C., there will be a NATO summit taking place. And the history of where the United States has been on Ukraine membership. This last NATO summit, not all that long ago, the United States was pretty much almost alone in holding back on steps for Ukraine, whereas the previous summit, we were pushing everybody else to give the green light to Ukraine. So this discussion that we're going to have this morning, I think, is very timely and very important. And Herman Pirchner, who is the president of the American Foreign Policy Council and a very good friend and a member of the foundation's Friends of Ukraine network. Herman, you're the moderator. I turn the show over to you.
Thank you, Bob. And thanks to you and Nadia and everybody at the Friends of Ukraine Network for hosting this very timely conference. Of course, everything first on our list is getting aid to Ukraine and the vote through Congress. But it's important to think about the day after as well. And I'm reminded of Freddie Clay's book. Fred was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during Reagan, and his most well-known book is Every War Must End. And his point was we don't think early enough about how wars end. And it's clear that the war cannot and should not end without security guarantees for Ukraine. And top on that list is NATO, because it's a firmer guarantee than the Budapest Accord, which had a lot of fuzzy language to put it mildly. And I'm so happy today to kick off this panel that has such a strong background. I think everybody on the panel could talk for the full hour and a half that we have, but we're going to limit the opening statements to 10 to 15 minutes, at which time we'll give the panelists some opportunity to ask each other questions before taking questions from the virtual audience. And is Kurt Volker on?
I don't believe he's on yet. I know he's coming because he had texted me. So
okay, well, why don't we start out with Paula Dobriansky. Paula was once the youngest professional staff member at the National Security Council, and since then has held a variety of senior government posts, including Undersecretary of State for 8 years. She's vice chairman of the Schoolcraft Center at the Atlantic Council, and I'm proud to say also a member of the advisory board of the American Foreign Policy Council. She's traveled very widely in recent years, especially to Europe, and we look forward to hearing her comments about NATO, and I can't think of anybody better to kick off the discussion.
Thank you so much, Herman, and also thank you, Bob. And I'm also a proud member of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's network, if you will, and group. So let me begin. I don't think I'm going to be speaking for 10 or 15 minutes, but I'd like to put forth some specific points. And let me congratulate the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for holding this discussion at this very time. First, I'd like to start with, which I wasn't intending to, Bob, what you just said. You know, it's interesting when I look back, and I remember very well when there were the first opening of bringing countries into NATO. And in that case, it was exactly the case that the countries were very anxious, many of them in Central Eastern Europe were very interested in becoming members. And in particular, what I recall, you had not only Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, but by the way, I remember very distinctly Mircea Joanna, who is now the Deputy Secretary General at NATO. He was the Romanian ambassador to the United States. And I don't know how many of you know this, but he was pounding the pavement because he was pointing out that in his own country, there was such a high percentage of people, of Romanians who wanted to be part of NATO. And in this regard, he was pushing, bring us in the first round, bring us in the first round. Romania ultimately came into NATO, but I do want to underscore that very, very point of the enthusiasm that has existed. There was nothing that was forced from the United States. On the contrary. And then I look at our colleague here from Estonia. I do remember also in the next wave, because I remember this very distinctly, some of the debates that were taking place, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And I hope my colleague doesn't mind this. Some in the but some in the United States were, oh, maybe we should only bring in Lithuania. And quite frankly, Estonia pounded the pavement, so did Latvia. And in the end, the three countries also came in the next wave. And I remember also very well that Poland was very engaged in this effort. So a little bit of history, and Robert, in your opening, you know, you were mentioning, in fact, I think you said General Breedlove was sharing that insight. I myself, from sitting in a different space, actually at the time, remember it quite well. I'd like to make several other points here about NATO. First, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary. The United States will be the host of the summit for this summer. And the issue is what will happen at that summit. And in this context, I would like to say, I think we need to have a resounding yes to Ukraine in NATO, very specifically. Vilnius took place. I think that was an opportunity to bring this forward, and forward in a way that demonstrated that Ukraine was not just partially or notionally or down the road, but now we're serious. Ukraine has to be part of NATO and begin that accession process. We have that opportunity this summer to do that. And I would like to first state that this is a key time to have this discussion, because that is what we must see happen. It can't be a replay of Bucharest. And with regard to Vilnius, I will pick out the fact, I think Ukrainians were gratified, of course, of the fact that there is a Ukraine-NATO Council, which enables Ukraine to bring some issues forward. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't stand up to, quite frankly, Ukraine being brought in and having that accession process and a clear statement of Ukraine being in NATO. So that's my first point. A second is the term of deterrence. There have been quite a few op-eds, and I will be restating many of the op-eds that say the greatest deterrence against future aggression relative to Ukraine would be, in fact and indeed, becoming a member of NATO. The Ukrainians have said quite clearly, look, we know we're in the middle of a war, This is an unusual time for a session of NATO membership. However, here, in terms of Article 5, we are not actually saying we are expecting others to invoke Article 5. We want to win this war, and as part of that path, this kind of deterrent backdrop will make a difference in terms of our stance and in terms of the way forward. So I want to also put that on the table because many invoke that issue of, well, what about Article 5 and what about this situation? And in this case, I think that Ukraine itself has stated very clearly, look, we're not expecting you to come in. I want to make two more points here. One about the Budapest Memorandum. I believe also both Robert, you mentioned it. I think Herman, you also just did. But I want to say it because very strikingly in terms of Ukraine, where it's been and where it is now. First, the fact is that Ukraine and its population wasn't actually enamored with taking this step. It was maybe a little under 50%. Now it's overwhelming in terms of the population's desire to come into NATO. And I think also part of that reason is we had the Budapest Memorandum in which it was promised to Ukraine that if they gave up their nuclear weapons, that in return, they would be promised, actually, the protection of their territorial integrity and sovereignty. We know that did not happen. So it goes back to the point about what is the greatest deterrent? What is the greatest security guarantee? A bilateral arrangement is not the most ideal. There are other models that have been put forward and suggested. The greatest deterrent is collective security, which is embodied in NATO. And for that reason, I'm strongly behind that and want to see in the summer that there is clear action of bringing Ukraine in. And my very final point is, I want to go back to the beginning. Now, this war really began, as has been pointed out, in 2014 with the invasion of Ukraine. And here we are at the present time. But what I want to point out is, early on in the second onslaught, actually, when Putin brought forward, to the Ukrainians, you must not be in NATO, there's an important point that needs to be mentioned here. The context was not just to be not in NATO, but it was to codify in the Ukrainian constitution that Ukraine will never, ever become part of NATO. I'm saying that because, again, it just underscores an outrageous violation of rule of law, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and is unacceptable. And needless to say, the Ukrainians and Zelensky said immediately that is not on the table and that will never, ever be the case. So in conclusion, thank you, Bob, and the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for bringing us together. Very timely. This issue is crucial, not just for Ukraine, but as we know, for all of the surrounding countries and Ukraine and the NATO Atlantic Alliance members, with Finland and Sweden now in. It just underscores how crucial security guarantees in a robust way and an assured way will really matter. So with that, I will end and just thank you. And I'm delighted to see that now Ambassador Kurt Volker is with us, and no less our colleague from Estonia. So back to you, Herman.
Thanks, Paula. Apt comments as always. We'll move now to Ambassador Kurt Volker, who's had a distinguished diplomatic career serving in London, Brussels, Budapest, Bosnia, among other places. Most relevant, he was George W. Bush's last ambassador to NATO, and until 2019 served as a special representative to Ukraine for Donald Trump. He resigned in 2019. So, Ambassador Volker, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Herman, and it's good to see everyone. I completely agree with what Paula said. I think there's very little to add. to the argument that she made, I would just stress a couple things that are entirely consistent with what Paula said. The first is that we need to recognize that the time period we're in now is very, very different from the past recent rounds of NATO enlargement, when we brought in the Baltic states or brought in Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, or even Croatia, Albania, and so forth. This is a very different time. It's a time where we have an active war going on in Europe, where Putin has really unmasked himself as an imperialist and an aggressor who denies the rights of neighboring peoples to live in peace next to Russia. He wants to take their territory and is willing to kill as many people as possible to achieve his goals. This is a very different time. It is much more like 1938, where you have Hitler on the move, starting to take territories like Austria or the Sudetenland. And if he's not stopped, he keeps going. And that is very much what we see right now. So we have to actually rise to the occasion to stop him. The other historical reference point that comes to my mind is, rather than thinking about NATO enlargement, I think about the founding of NATO in 1949, because in that instance, we actually didn't have allies. We actually came to the defense of Europe twice, in World War I and World War II, when they weren't allies. And we did it because we felt it was in our interest to do so. And then we founded NATO when no one was actually an ally. We had fought together in World War II, but we wanted to create a permanent alliance as a deterrent, because we knew that if we didn't, we would face the risk of war again. And I think that is the logic or the mentality we have to have again now. If we do not bring Ukraine into NATO as soon as possible, we will face a bigger war and a wider war, possibly including NATO members. So if we want to prevent that, if we want to prevent war, the best thing to do is to bring Ukraine into NATO as quickly as possible. The second point I wanted to make is the Washington summit. It was brought up already by Paula and others. Imagine if we just take a pass. Imagine if all of the NATO leaders get together on the 75th anniversary of the alliance to commemorate that. This war is going on in Ukraine. We've said now since 2008, so for whatever that is, 16 years, that Ukraine will someday become a member of NATO. And yet, at this time, at an hour of need in Ukraine, when everyone has their eyes focused on the alliance, when the only question Putin is watching to see is, what do we say about Ukrainian NATO membership? And if we do not advance Ukraine's NATO membership, it will be seen as an incredible show of weakness by the alliance and an encouragement to Putin to keep extending his war. He will see that there is a lack of resolve. So it's incredibly important that we send the opposite signal to Putin. Instead of telling him that we won't invite Ukraine to join NATO as long as the war is going on, which encourages more war, we should tell him that we are beginning now to bring this war to an end. We are going to provide Ukraine the equipment and arms that it needs. We're going to make sure that they do not fail, that Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent European democracy. They will, in short order, become a member of NATO, and that will pave the way also for becoming a full member of the European Union. And this train is leaving the station. I believe the way to go about this at the summit is to issue a formal invitation for Ukraine to join. As I think everyone will recall, issuing the invitation starts a process, but it's a process that takes a little bit of time to complete. In the case of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, it was about a 2-year process of negotiating accession protocols, getting ratification in each of the NATO country parliaments, then depositing that instrument of ratification and formally bringing them into the alliance. In the case of Sweden, it is still almost done, but just another step has to be taken before it is final. And this has been a relatively fast process in the case of Sweden, but still close to a year. So we should issue the invitation now, recognizing it's still going to take some time to get over the finish line. There are a lot of discussions taking place. This is the next point. A lot of discussions taking place about security commitments, security assurances for Ukraine. from G7 countries. Germany has done, UK has done, France has done, US is in the process. These are good. They are useful, perhaps, even for covering a period of what we would call a security gap between the time of an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO and the time that invitation is fully realized and Ukraine actually joins. So they're useful for that purpose. But no one should confuse them with what NATO membership actually means. These are all positive steps, but they do not substitute for NATO membership. They can be steps along the way. And Paula mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. We do not want to see a series of bilateral security assurances like this be made and then prove that they are not even worth the paper that they are written on. We actually have to take them and move beyond them to get to a point of NATO membership. And then the final thing is, if you, as Paula and I and others, believe that we need to actually get this moving, that we see a future in which Ukraine is a member of NATO and the EU, and that is the pathway to reestablishing security in Europe, then we should get on with that as quickly as possible in terms of helping Ukraine push back the Russians militarily. We should stop haggling over what types of weapon systems. We should be looking at what we have in our arsenals as excess defense articles and start providing those. There's nothing wrong with reauthorizing Lend-Lease legislation so that there is a big number out there that is available to Ukraine if they need it, while we should also get on with providing the foreign military assistance that is pending in Congress right now. But all of these things should be happening because they all send a signal to Vladimir Putin, and the absence of those things also sends a signal for him to continue the war. So I think we need to get on with all of the military effort to help Ukraine win the war, defeat the Russian forces, and signal that that is leading inexorably to NATO membership as well, so Putin gets the message. I'll pause there and happy to continue in the discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll now go to Marko Mihkelson, who has served 21 years in the Parliament of Estonia, chairing the important national security committees of defense and foreign affairs, as well as European Union Affairs Committee. He's also served as a journalist and is formally studied in the recent history of Russia. And we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Best greetings to all of who listen us right now from NATO headquarters in Brussels. And I'm sorry to say that in half an hour I have to go to another meeting here, but I would start my comments with sort of celebratory note. Actually, this year is very significant, not only for NATO to celebrate 75th anniversary, but it is also extremely important year for us, for Estonia, for other Baltic nations, a number of our good allies in Eastern Europe who celebrate 20th anniversary of becoming NATO allies this month. Just 20 years ago this happened, and this is the best example actually how important is NATO enlargement and actually the processes around that, which have bolstered our democracies, small countries being in very difficult neighborhood as we speak about right now. And of course, we are very happy to see that our close neighbors, Finland, and hopefully on Monday, as I heard here in Brussels, will be official ceremony of raising Swedish flag here in front of NATO HQ, and a 32nd member of Alliance Sweden will be fully welcome. But going into the topic we discussed today, I would like to just reflect some recent memories from Ukraine. And last week, I spent 3 days on front lines in eastern Ukraine and in the southern front lines as well. Then I met more than a dozen brigades fighting for Ukraine independence and actually fighting for our freedom as well. And this was already my third trip to front lines since beginning full-scale invasion in February 22. And I must say that this trip was most difficult in a way to see how dramatic the situation, how critical the situation on the front lines actually is right now. Lack of ammunition, lack of necessary weaponry, limited possibility for Ukrainians to use those weapons they have today because of our limits, telling them that with Western weaponry you cannot hit Russian targets on Russian territory, but also on each of those front lines and points I visited, Russia has initiative, has strongly overwhelming firepower at the moment because of lack of ammunition from Ukrainian side. And this is, of course, has had an impact also on fighting morale from Ukrainian side. But at the same time, when I asked soldiers and commanders, what's going to happen during next weeks or months, and they said, like one, that we don't have alternative rather than to fight, because we see what will happen then if we give up fighting. The occupation will be terrible. The terror is enormous. And they defending their families, their kids, their country. And I hope that we all understand the urgency of the situation, and first and foremost, are very much looking forward that U.S. Congress can finally adopt this very important supplementary act and to supply critically needed help to Ukraine. But saying this, and I'm still seeing what I saw in Ukraine last week, I am optimistic because Ukrainians, as I said, they know that they don't have any other alternative rather than to fight till the victorious end. But sometimes in my conversation with my colleagues here in Europe, but also in the States, I do see that there is perhaps not full understanding in what kind of war we are in. And I would like to quote here Vladimir Putin, who actually in October 2023 said quite clearly, the Ukraine crisis is not a territorial conflict and not an attempt to establish regional geopolitical balance. The issue is much broader and more fundamental, and is about the principles underlying the new international order. And this is why I would like to remind all of you as well that, at the very beginning of this full-scale invasion against Ukraine, Russia made an ultimatum not only against Ukraine, but against NATO, demanding NATO allies to pull back from eastern flank to the 1997 line, which certainly mean and tell us what is the Russia's strategic aim: to destroy current security architecture, not only in Europe but in a transatlantic sphere, and overwhelm European security architecture and put us all to agree upon with accepting aggression and accepting Russian will to have a veto power, let's say, in the future over security challenges here in Europe. But one of the strategic aims, what Russia currently has also, and those invisible front lines are not only seen in Ukraine, but invisible ones are in our capitals, They would like to make us to be divided, Europe and the United States, make us to be weaker, and to create distrust among allies. And this is something what perhaps is the most dangerous, what we could see in coming months ahead of us. But finalizing with thoughts on Ukraine and NATO, obviously, I fully agree with Kurt and also Paula, and from telling from our own experience, Ukraine must be accepted as a member of NATO as soon as possible. And hopefully, during Washington summit, allies, including also the United States and Germany, will agree that we have to start the process of invitation for NATO membership to Ukraine. This is exactly what Kurt said as well, that Russia is paying a very tense attention to that. What kind of language is coming out from Washington summit? Are we able to make a bold movement ahead with the invitation for Ukraine? And are we ready strategically to act more actively or proactively, helping Ukraine, taking down all the limits of using the weaponry what we send to Ukraine. And last but not least, what is the most important is that what is our will? How would like to see this war to be finished? I would like to hear this from our leaders more often, that our aim should be strategic defeat of Russia in this war of aggression against Ukraine. And not only the victory of Ukraine, but exactly the strategic defeat of Russia in this war, because that would have enormously important impact on what we see not only in Europe, because to re-establish a viable and lasting peace in Europe is possible only after a strategic defeat of Russia in this war and full membership of Ukraine in NATO. But also that will have an enormous impact what we see happening right now in the Middle East, in Sahel region, but also in East Asia, when it comes to the question of Taiwan's security and stability in that region. So our country, Estonia, but also very like-minded countries of ours, our allies, will push hard on diplomatic front lines to assure our colleagues and allies, specifically in Washington, but also in Berlin and other capitals, that we have to be today more active, more proactive in order to make sure that Russia will understand that they won't be able to win this war, and those dreams to reshape world order are going to stay only dreams in the heads of those who run Russia today. Thank you.
Thank you. While we're waiting for General Clark to join us, I might put forth a couple questions that have been coming in from our listenership and viewership. One has to do with the effectiveness of Russian disinformation and the bad facts they insert into debate in Europe and the United States. What can be better done to combat that? And a parallel question has to do with why aren't we also on the attack instead of just defending against Russian disinformation? Why aren't we talking more about the atrocities committed by Russia, Russia's imperial ambitions, and so forth? I don't know who wants to start out. I'd like to hear from all three of you.
I'm going to jump in. I'll make a brief comment. And because I actually know and read, I see on the chat Victor Rudd, who wrote made the comment. So I want to acknowledge him. What his points are, I mean, his specific points really make complete sense. First, one point he has embodied in his chat question which I want to pull out, is he says, shouldn't we stop focusing on this question about NATO and the past and this debate and this issue about how, the quote unquote enlargement came about? I agree with him completely, because it is disinformation. And that's what we were discussing at the very beginning here. The fact that countries of Central and Eastern Europe are extremely desirous. This was something that was done and evolved in a transparent, very direct way. There's a historical account of it, and it is disinformation to say that, oh no, this was hoisted upon Russia, Russia was excluded, this was done in a certain way. I'm sorry, that argumentation is not accurate. It's something that constantly comes up. So Victor, that slice of your question, and I'll pass the other questions to others, but I want to say that slice of your question, I think you're spot on to point it out. Over to the other two.
Well, I'll just jump in as well. I know I will give the answer that Bob McConnell would give if he were asked that question, which is we need our leaders to speak about this frequently and forcefully. We find, at least in the United States, but I would argue in some other countries as well, the leaders don't really want to talk about this. They seem to want to help Ukraine, quote unquote, as long as it takes, but they're not taking on the broader narrative that NATO is a defensive alliance. It is there to protect countries. Countries join freely because they are concerned about their security. NATO is not targeting or threatening anyone. No one is attacking Russia. No one is trying to seize Russian territory. Russia has had peaceful borders with NATO countries ever since NATO was founded in 1949. None of this, none of the narrative that Putin puts out there has any merit at all. And people need to get out, and our president needs to come out and keep hammering that point, that this is not about war, and it's not about seizing territory or threatening Russia. It's about protecting people and maintaining peace.
Yeah, if I may also to jump in on this, exactly what you could said right now, that we should not kind of go into the same trap and start to discuss about is a NATO threat to Russia or not, or in NATO's enlargement. This is Russian narrative, what they disseminating everywhere to making us to kind of being not able to be a strong and strategically thinking in terms of what should be done in order to stop Russia being imperialist, being aggressive, and I think that NATO has proven through our 75 years that this is the best Russia policy what West can have to protect our democracies, smaller and bigger ones, specifically here in Europe. But this is similarly important also for the United States, because there are other challengers as well in the world today, not only Russia, who would like to divide us, like China, for instance. So in that case, I think that when it comes to disinformation campaigns and malign operations, today, I guess our intelligence services must be more vigilant, especially when it comes to counterintelligence in our member states, because I'm more than sure that in today and in specifically in upcoming weeks and months, Russia will activate their assets everywhere, and specifically while this year is very critical with so many elections here and there, that obviously this is good ground for this kind of malign operations. And while we are in the war, I mean, in terms of the war in Europe, what we have not seen since the end of World War II, and aims what Russia has, as I mentioned, their kind of vision, partly together with China, to reshape world order in a way that the Western dominance or norms and principles of rule of law and international law can be redefined by the will of authoritarian states like Russia, China, or Iran, then it's obviously that those front lines are running not only in Ukraine today, but also in our capitals. And this is why extremely important is to also to pay more attention to psychological defense of our open societies.
Thank you. We have a question regarding why Lend-Lease has not come into play in the U.S. And I think that's primarily for the American speakers, and maybe we'll get Bob McConnell in to give his view of that too. Why don't we have Lend-Lease?
I was going to suggest maybe Bob McConnell should go first. He's the Hill guy. You just have to unmute yourself. There you go.
It's a mystery that has not picked up more support. It seems to be caught up in the same thing that the supplemental is. It hasn't had traction. It's been brought up several times. It's been brought up, a year or two ago, and it just doesn't seem to get legs. The whole notion of doing everything we can to be able to provide everything we can and should be providing Ukraine should be a top priority. But whether it's Congress, and I'll add something else here, whether it's Congress and the hesitancy caused by a relatively small number of people, you also have the administration, which when it has had money, has refused to give things, weapon systems, platforms we know Ukraine needs. So we have hesitancy, fecklessness in our government in both branches, and Lend-Lease would be a good tool to use. And we're not doing it, and we're not using or providing weapon systems that we have available that are in our stockpiles and not being used and are in retirement or to be in retirement, but would take very little to get ready and ship, and we don't need appropriations for that. Kurt might have more to say.
Yeah, if I could just add a point to this, the Lend-Lease legislation that was passed in 22 expired in the end of October 23. It now needs to be reintroduced and reapproved. I suspect the reason that it's not being done immediately is people don't want to create an alternative to passing the appropriation that's in front of the Congress right now for foreign military assistance. And I agree that that package needs to be approved, but I don't think we should see these as alternatives. I think we should do both and I hope that members of Congress and staff who are supportive of Ukraine would be reintroducing this legislation as soon as possible.
And I'll just add a footnote because I think both have well articulated what's at stake. It's worth reminding ourselves the formal title of it. It was Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022. I mean, does our Congress remember that? And that was 2022. The intent was as vital then as it is now.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Opponents of Ukraine joining NATO, or at least anytime soon, point to the border dispute, which will be ongoing with Russia. And they say a country that has a border dispute with another country should not be admitted to NATO. How should Friends of Ukraine respond?
If I may jump in first, because I really, in a few minutes' time, I have to leave our panel. But, I would like to say that Estonia and Russia, we don't have a border agreement so far, ratified one. Yes, signed in 2014, few days before Russia started occupation of Crimea, but it's still not ratified. So I don't buy this kind of argument. Yes, during the wartime, obviously it is difficult to imagine that Ukraine will be accepted as a full member of NATO. But the process of invitation and getting ready to become full member of NATO will take anyway time. Even at the peacetime, when Estonia joined NATO, we got invitation in Prague summit in 2002, and it took for us that time over 1.5 years to become full member of NATO. So what is today is important that as allies, we promised to Ukraine already in 2008 and also to Georgia that they will become members of NATO one day. So what, 16 years passed, and Ukrainians fighting today for our future and actually for NATO as well in Ukraine today, to avoid direct confrontation between NATO and Russia serves our interest, and we should make sure that at least during Washington summit we say that Ukraine's invitation process is open and will start, and what is also matter of his decision, a kind of the importance of decision to invite and to bring Ukraine in as a full member of NATO, that will have a tremendous impact, obviously, for Ukraine, and that will help them to become in the future also members of the EU. I'm fully agree with those who say that Ukraine will become first member of NATO and then the EU. But also that will have a tremendous impact on this kind of imperial ambitions in Russia, that without Ukraine, which will become accepted as a full member of free Western community, is as a defense line, a strong defense line against any other attempt by Russia to re-establish this evil empire, what they are right now trying to reincarnate. So this is extremely important strategically in our interest to bring Ukraine into NATO.
Thank you. Bob,
And
do
thank
we
you very
have
much.
any, thank you. Do we have any update on Wes Clark's availability? I know there's some technical difficulties.
I don't have his phone number. I've sent a couple of emails, and I've just sent to a couple of people that I believe have his phone number. So I don't have an answer. I'm still pushing.
Well,
Herman and Bob, as you're just sorting that out, I was going to just continue the conversation and just add something, and I bet Kurt will as well. You know, our colleague who just unfortunately had to, drop off because of business at NATO, Marko Mihkelson of Estonia, he said something that I also wanted to broaden our conversation. He mentioned about how Ukraine coming into NATO serves our interests and our strategic interests. I think that was a very direct and clear statement about why we should care. It isn't, by the way, only about Ukraine and the circumstance at hand, but it does serve our strategic interests. And this is the point I wanted to add. When we look at this situation, we are looking at it usually up front, because it's NATO, of Europe. But this has global ramifications, and I really want to emphasize this. I noticed that the Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida, he came to the United States, I believe it was last year, and he gave a speech at Johns Hopkins University. And he made a very strong appeal to the fact that what happens in Ukraine is actually going to have dire consequences for Asia. And the reason why I'm singling this out, I believe that he has been invited to speak before our Congress. I saw a note that's going to be forthcoming. I'm injecting into this conversation that this issue of NATO enlargement and here in particular, Ukraine coming into NATO, that it does have global ramifications. It's been one that's been articulated not just by NATO members and by the transatlantic community, but also by the Indo-Pacific community, and in which there are non-NATO members. And they're part of it because of the kind of security arrangement and the concern they have also about aggression in the Indo-Pacific. So if I could, I wanted to inject that in the conversation. It's a different point, but it's one that's worth taking stock of, that this does have global ramifications. And one more, I've been struck by the fact that also Stoltenberg has spoken to the issue of China. And that's been on the agenda, and that brings us, whole in this case of not just the arena of the transatlantic, but also the Indo-Pacific. Back to you, Herman.
Paula, let me add on to that. I've in the past year been in South Korea and Vietnam, and they feel, as the Japanese do, that if Russia is seen to gain land through the use of nuclear blackmail, war crimes, aggression, then it strengthens those that would be aggressive territorially in China, in North Korea. And by the way, and you hear the same thing from the Middle East. Iran will get bolder if Russia wins too. I think we are less aware of the danger of Russian imperialism than people that are on the borders of countries that threaten territorial aggression and are using their military to expand their territories. People here in the United States, Russia's a long way away, but it's dangerous to us, clearly. Kurt, you want to get in on this?
No, I think you've said it all.
All right. Well, do you have a question you would like to put to raise to Paula, or to some observations that the participants would benefit from? And I'll see what new questions are coming in.
I have one. It's not a question as much as a comment, and then what do we do about it? Before the last NATO summit, I forget how many it was, 26 heads of foreign affairs committees of European parliaments came to Washington to push our government to support Ukraine getting a road path to membership at Vilnius. We obviously did not do that. We resisted it. We were, I guess, one of only 2 countries that resisted it. Those leaders, not all at one time, but they're back in Washington pushing for next summer. They are getting very, well, I'll characterize it, ugly American kind of pushback at the State Department not to keep bringing this up, that the United States doesn't want this next July. What do you think we can do to turn our government around and get them open to providing some solid, as we've discussed here, solid indication that Ukraine is going to be in NATO?
Well, that is the question, isn't it, Bob? Is that we're all sitting here and agreeing with each other, but the U.S. administration right now is in a different place. And everything I've been told is that it is coming straight from the top, that it's the president himself who believes that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO, and that it would be escalatory for the U.S. to support NATO membership for Ukraine right now, and that it could lead to an expansion of the war, World War III and so forth. So we have to see whether it's possible for President Biden to change that calculus. And I think a lot of the arguments we've made are not original. People have probably heard them before, but they haven't been persuasive. And I think just a couple of the other arguments to make are that This is really an issue of the legacy of President Biden and his administration. Do they lay the basis for a lasting peace in Europe, or do they leave with a growing war? I think that's one major consideration there. And it is, essentially where President Biden's place is in the spectrum of presidents who've had to deal with these issues of peace, war and peace in Europe. And I hope that he would make the tough call to actually say we need to do this now.
I'll just add, I agree precisely with what Kurt said. I think that, and actually the word legacy was coming to my mind, because it is ultimately an issue on which President Biden has to make the decision and lead and carry those who are skeptics with him. But he will also carry those who are real enthusiasts, and there are many of them, not only in the United States, but also abroad, as you referenced, Bob, the delegation that's back here again. I do think that I think, Kurt, you put it really exceedingly well. It's not even only about legacy, it's legacy about which way forward is it? Is it going to be a continuation of a very brutal and really unjustified war? Or is it going to be a point in history that's going to be remembered forever and ever, the position of the United States? So other than that, the only practical other comment I can make on this is that one has to continue really pushing the issue and making the arguments. And in the best way one can. Kurt is right. Everyone knows the arguments, but it's always worth stating and restating and restating.
We have a question from Ambassador Jim Gilmore, the former governor of Virginia, who wants to know what we need to do to break the logjam in Congress. Bob, you want to start off with that one?
I wish I knew the secret bullet. It is so hard to figure out. You hear all the stuff about the Freedom Caucus. I mean, I'm not sure that that's the right term. If there were a Freedom Caucus, they should be wanting freedom in Ukraine, because as some of the quotes that were used earlier today, if our friends are not free, we have a threat to us. But they've continued to call themselves the Freedom Caucus and stand in the way of supporting freedom in Ukraine. I know the ambassador has pushed members he knows. I know former members of Congress, including high-ranking former members of Congress, have gone to the speaker, have urged him, you need to do what is right. And I hate to be as blunt as this, but there comes a time in a public official's work that they have to do what is right, regardless of the personal consequences. Paula made the comment earlier, if that supplemental was brought to the floor, we know it will pass. It will stir up the Freedom Caucus. They will maybe strike out at the speaker, and they've done that before. But what is right is what is right, and what needs to be done needs to be done. The thing that strikes me about the members of the Freedom Caucus and the opponents of this, the money for Ukraine, their arguments are well known. And they repeat them over and over. But at this point, maybe when they started making those arguments, they believed them and thought they were true. At this point, they have to know their arguments are false. The whole thing, I mean, standing up and saying, we've given $100 billion to Ukraine. We haven't given $100 billion to Ukraine. The amount isn't $100 billion to begin with. And secondly, as finally the administration has started talking about this, but it needs to be on every American's minds because it's not. That money is being spent in the United States of America. And what is it doing? It's generating jobs. And maybe more importantly, it is rebuilding our military that needs rebuilding. We give good but aged weapons to Ukraine. That's not a criticism of those weapons. But we take this money and produce, manufacture advanced versions of those same weapons, making our military stronger. When they say we have to do the border before we do Ukraine, are they saying we are no longer a superpower? A superpower can walk and chew gum at the same time. And if they make the argument, we don't have the money, I've made this in speeches in congressional districts where members make that argument. That is a false argument. I ask those constituents, has this member introduced legislation, demanded investigations, pushed the Justice Department to look into the $100 billion plus annual Medicare fraud? If they're really after money, there are ways to do it without sacrificing our national security interests. Jim Gilmore, if Governor Gilmore, if I had an answer on how to get this thing through, I don't know. It's the same thing we're talking about with the administration with NATO. We just have to keep pushing. We have to keep pushing. You know, if a member stands up in front of an audience and I'm there and they're talking about we can't do that, you know, start talking about the abductions of children, the reprogramming of them. Under the Genocide Convention, that is genocide. And it's been going on since 2014. And I know, and I think Herman knows this from personal experiences out in the country, outside the Beltway. When you bring up the abductions, the audiences, we didn't know about that. We can't stand for that. There are cases to be made that aren't being made by, you know, I'm not a bully pulpit. The president of the United States is. And I've been around this town long enough. Everyone on this panel and Governor Gilmore have been around. You can see what happens when an administration makes something its big priority. The president is making speeches. Cabinet members are making speeches. They're out on the road. The legislative affairs offices are on the Hill. Push, push, push. You haven't seen that in the push to get support for Ukraine. I haven't told you, Governor, how to do it. I just said the problem, and I think we just have to keep pushing as much as we can from every direction.
I would agree with that. And I was just going to add two other points. And thank you, Ambassador and Jim, for the question. Bob is right. We have to keep pushing. But 2 points I did want to make. Another argument that comes to the forefront is the argument about, well, are we doing more than Europe? Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, was just in the United States. And when he was here, he did deliver remarks at the Atlantic Council. And in his specific address at the Atlantic Council, he actually cited the figures and made the point that actually Europe is actually giving more in its amount to Ukraine at this time. And he even said, and it should, in terms of thinking about security, stability, and the proximity of Ukraine to not only Poland, but the rest of Europe. I wanted to make that point because that comes up. And then secondly, Bob mentioned, I think also very well, the argument about who really benefits. Mark Thiessen, who I think is known by all of us, wrote a really outstanding piece that did appear in a number of media outlets, and including widely disseminated on the Hill. He was someone who used to work on the Hill. And he really detailed actually how these monies benefit the United States, I think by some almost, it was close to 90%. So I wanted to underscore that point. Bob did say it. I think the arguments that have been put forward are not ones that hold water. And I just think the arguments on the side of why this is in our strategic interests needs to be made.
Paula, I know you and I think also Kurt have been in Western Europe recently. I think the audience would be curious to hear how the debate on Ukraine has been changing during your visits to Western and Eastern Europe.
Sure, I'll happy to join on that. Before I do, let me just add to what Bob and Paula said about the Congress. I think for Governor Gilmore, the issue is not Ukraine. There are over 300 votes in favor of aid to Ukraine. That's not the problem. The problem is the political pathway for the speaker to bring it to the floor without the small minority in the Republican Party filing a motion to vacate and trying to bring down his speakership. And for that to happen, for him to avoid that challenge, he needs to deliver something on the border. I think that's the key. And I think one thing that the speaker said maybe a month ago, I would suggest we have another look at, which is he believes that there should be up or down votes on issues in the Congress, not lumping things together as we always do in an omnibus bill. And in this case, it would be very doable in the Congress to have another up or down vote on HR 2, the immigration legislation that they want, and an up or down vote on aid to Ukraine, as well as an up or down vote on aid to Israel and on aid to Taiwan. And I'm fairly confident all of those would pass, and it would be faithful to the minority in his party to make sure they get their hearing while at the same time advancing the bill or advancing the issues. The alternative to that is the Brian Fitzpatrick legislation, which is possible. I think he will have a coalition of support for that as well, but it doesn't address the issue of immigration. And I still think that that's a risk for the speaker, which he will want to address before bringing something to the floor. But that's the crux of the matter. As for your question, Herman, about what I'm hearing in Europe, let me just say I was at the Munich Security Conference, where, of course, you meet a lot of different people. And then I went from there to Chisinau, and then Odessa, and then Kyiv, and then to Warsaw, and have had a lot of conversations with people over the past couple of weeks. There is incredible anxiety in Europe right now because we are not passing the military assistance to Ukraine. They see depletion of ammunition stocks. They are doing a lot of things to increase their own efforts to procure ammunition and give it to Ukraine. The Czechs have led an effort to kind of scour the earth for where you can find appropriate ammunition, and then getting the EU, getting different EU states to help pay for it. Many EU countries, and in fact the EU itself, is putting forward funds to expand defense industrial production to include the types of shells that are needed for Ukraine. But all of this is not enough and not fast enough compared to what the US could do if we just turned on the spigot. And there is deep concern that Ukraine is going to suffer and increasingly suffer as long as we don't get them the ammunition that they need. There's also concern about President Trump getting reelected, because the media has highlighted a lot of statements that he has made, including one at a campaign rally where he said that he told a European leader when he was president before that if they hadn't paid their share of 2% of GDP toward defense, that he would encourage Putin to do whatever he wanted, which sends a very chilling signal to our allies in Europe, who understand that we need to be showing strength and unity and solidarity in the face of Putin's aggression. So a lot of anxiety in Europe right now. I believe that Congress passing this aid to Ukraine will actually do a lot to alleviate that anxiety. I think seeing things flowing back to Ukraine again will give them a bit of reassurance that we will get through this. And as far as the future president goes, whether it's President Trump or President Biden, or if she manages to pull off a miracle today, Nikki Haley, I think that it will not be as dramatic as many in the media, many of the European allies are making it out to be. We will have to continue to make the case, and we'll have to continue to urge support for Ukraine, but that'll be true no matter who's elected.
Herman, I'll mention my travels, a little different. I was in Poland, and then I am going to Italy and to Brussels, to NATO, actually in the Italy the day after tomorrow, and then to Brussels the upcoming week. But from Poland, I was in Delhi. And I was there for what's known as the Rasina Dialogue, which is it's kind of like the Munich of India, in the sense it's a major dialogue which is sponsored by the Ministry of External Affairs, their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But let me make two comments. On Poland, I think it's very clear the position that the Poles are taking. The mood, the tenor was absolutely a focus on the supplemental, the focus on what will happen in terms of the 2024 elections. What does it mean? A real focus on the actual NATO summit this summer, what will be announced or not announced. So I think it's very clear there, the tone and the tenor has been extremely steadfast. And the focus, and by the way, I might add, we know there's been an election that took place in Poland. With regard to this issue, I would say that the concerns about security interests and stability are as great as ever, as they were before, and they are now. In terms of India, it was interesting to me that actually many foreign ministers, because this is at a foreign ministerial head of state level, came from Munich and to India. There was an extensive discussion about what are the ramifications for the Indo-Pacific, as I mentioned. And to give an example, there were many leaders there from Australia who were talking about what, in fact, is indeed playing out in Ukraine, what Russia, China, the relationship there, what are the ramifications here for their region. So I will just simply say the mood and the tenor was one of great focus on it. It's a global issue. It's not just an issue of the transatlantic proportions, but one that has a much broader reach. And there's grave concern about all of the upcoming events and what it will mean. Australia, by the way, is also a NATO non-member. And, you know, the question, what will come out of the summit, the NATO summit this summer?
Thanks, Paula. One of our Canadian audience, Bob Onishchuk, asked what will come of the effort to have a discharge petition in the House. Is that viable or not? And we'll kick that to Bob, who probably watches it closer than the rest of us.
Well, I think it's possible, but
you might explain what it is, because not everybody in the audience will know what a discharge petition is.
Well, without going into all the details of it, if you have the requisite number, and it's a large number of members signed to discharge a piece of legislation, it comes to the floor regardless of whether it's brought by the leadership or not. It's put up to a vote. And they're circulating petitions, but they're not all targeted at the exact same piece of legislation. So it's, again, we've got divisions that need to be worked out to make things work. I wanted to add one thing to what Kurt said, because I couldn't agree more that if you brought up border, it would pass. If you brought up Ukraine, it would pass. If you brought up Israel and Taiwan, all those separately, it would pass. The problem, a problem, is that the Freedom Caucus does not want the immigration thing to come up by itself, because they know it'd pass, but they know it wouldn't have a chance in the Senate. So it's the leverage of having them linked that is causing consternation, because together you then have forces that are for and forces that are against, and it's going to take pressure from everywhere on members of Congress and on the leadership to get that up. As far as the discharge petitions, I'm watching it closely. I think the people circulating it and so forth, they're very serious about this. At the same time, they're working behind the scenes to try and get the supplemental up so that you solve the problem. And you have all of this going on while you have the clock ticking still on portions of our government that need funding to go forward. So, I mean, it's a meeting of all kinds of forces that are not working to the benefit of Ukraine's funding.
Am I
Herman?
understanding that you're thinking that if the supplemental does not include aid for Ukraine, the discharge petition becomes more likely?
I think so. Because, I mean, members there are members, good members, and you mentioned Fitzpatrick, Kurt. They want to get this done one way or another, and each of those new pieces of legislation solve certain problems, but raise others in the context of the procedural realities in the House.
If I can add one detail to what Bob said, the number needed of signatures is 218. And what happens is, if there are 218 signatures, it's deposited with the Rules Committee, and then it has to sit for 30 working days of the Congress before it comes to the floor. So it takes a long time. 30 working days can take 2 months or more. And there are petitions going around now on 2 bills. One of them is the Senate bill, and then the other is the Fitzpatrick bill. And I suspect that we're going to see both happen simultaneously. People will be collecting signatures to try to get to 218, while they're also seeing if there's a way to actually advance the legislation before that.
Herman, I
didn't mention, but that the hesitancy is, as Kurt pointed out, and I skipped over all the little details, but that time to get a discharge and actually have that vote, nobody wants to wait that long. I mean, Fitzpatrick doesn't want to wait that long. Ukraine certainly doesn't want to wait that long. And so you have all these forces, but it's you don't want to use inflammatory words, but I mean, there's a certain level of culpability in our system not being able to get this job done.
Herman, I wasn't going to comment on this question, but I was actually going to draw Kurt out on an issue that, no, seriously, I think I saw it somewhere in the chat, and that you, being the former ambassador to NATO, I mean, this cold. The question of Article 5 comes up, and that was another one that, some members raised, but, and others raised. Can you say a few words? I think those on this call would certainly, in this conference, would really appreciate hearing really what is the truth about Article 5 and the parameters here, that this isn't a block to Ukraine coming into NATO. If you don't mind, and I hope you didn't mind my reaching out to you, I did see something I think might have come in on the chat.
Yeah, of course. I'm very happy to. And 1 second. So it's so short. Let me just read it. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is as follows. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. And consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in the exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. So in other words, there will be a collective response to any aggression against a NATO member, but the treaty does not specify what the collective response will be. And it does not state that NATO members must send ground troops to the front line, although that's certainly a possibility. So, and you certainly don't want to rule that out. So the bottom line here is that NATO has a lot of discretion as to what Article 5 steps will be taken if a member is attacked. And the only time it was ever invoked was after 9/11. And NATO countries did not send troops to go fight terrorists in Afghanistan. That was done by a coalition of the willing outside NATO. But what was done was NATO countries sent aircraft to fly over North America to patrol the skies to make sure there weren't more 9/11 bombers out there for a week or two. So that was an appropriate response. In the case of Ukraine, we should be sitting down with Ukraine in the NATO-Ukraine Council right away and talking about exactly this question. What does Article 5 mean in the case of Ukraine? And I guarantee you, the Ukrainians will say, we don't need the troops. We do need your equipment. We do need your ammunition. And we could also then identify other things we could do that would be very helpful to Ukraine. For instance, participation directly in air defense to protect cities and civilians that are subject to bombardment. We could help with freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, which is something we should probably be doing anyway. We could be helping them with demining in the Black Sea as well. There's a lot of steps that we could be taking beyond what we're doing that would assist Ukraine in its hour of need as it's being attacked, that do not necessarily rise to NATO forces joining the fight against the Russians inside Ukraine or on Ukrainian territory. But again, we wouldn't want to rule that out in case that were needed. And in the case of the Baltic states, and I see Marko is no longer here in the meeting, but the Baltic states are a different category. They do not have the means to fight on their own without ground troops and others, help from NATO countries. It would be a different response if they were attacked. But in the case of Ukraine, we actually have some options about how to execute our obligations for collective defense if they were a member.
Thank you for that. And Herman, just back to you in 1 second. I wanted to connect a dot. And thank you, Kurt. I think it was important to have that articulation. You asked earlier, Herman, about our travels, where we've been and what the reaction is. I want to point out, actually, it was very interesting. President Macron of France recently did say and make the statement that, well, France, he said, maybe we should be sending some of our troops to Ukraine. There were others who differed with that, but why Kurt's point is, and what he articulated is key, it isn't a given in this case. It may be the case, and maybe, by the way, maybe France would take that step, but another country not. But I think that's a very important point that has to be on the table here, because that's another area where, particularly with some of our members, that you hear this statement a lot and a misconception.
Can I follow on Paula as well, too? Because I was not concerned by what Macron said, because what he said is it shouldn't be off the table, and said we shouldn't rule it out. Well, I agree with that. We shouldn't rule anything out. We spend too much time ruling things out. We should stop that. But I was more alarmed by the reaction to what he said, because all of a sudden you had the US administration, you had Chancellor Scholz, you had a few others come out and criticize him and suggest that, no, that's terrible. We would never do this. Well, that is sending exactly the wrong signal. We need to create uncertainty and concern on Putin's part about what his aggression might provoke, as opposed to reassuring him that there's no way we will do anything such as providing ground troops to Ukraine. So I was very much more concerned about the reaction to Macron than what Macron actually said.
And exactly. And that's why I wanted to draw you out, because you're right about the reaction and being concerned, but it's also something that constantly is being referenced as a block. So thank you.
Okay, we have 10 minutes left in our panel and time for maybe one or two more questions. We have one, is it really the case that U.S. defense companies cannot or will not produce weapons until funding is passed, or are they unwilling to take the risk to produce without guarantees of payment? And if funding is paid next week, what is the soonest that Ukraine can receive new weaponry?
I'll make a brief comment, and then I see Kurt has opened up his mic. I'm not aware of the companies, at least that I'm have heard from. They are anxious and interested in actually engaging, and I haven't heard that they are stalled because of what is happening. I'll put it this way, in other lanes. Sure, of course, there is a desire, of course, of, if you will, payment. But here in this case, this goes back to our conversation earlier of actually, who does this benefit? It does benefit actually us, and in turn, companies, workers. So that's the answer there. And secondly, as far as I know, they're waiting for the opening. And in this case, pink fingers, as I hear from many defense companies, are pointed at the Pentagon and the way in which this is done. But I mean, I'll give an example of where I think, you know, we have a number of Abrams tanks that are on the ground in Poland. The Poles were asking the question, can't we get more Abrams 1's tanks? And by the way, they announced in Poland they have their own manufacturing and ability to actually service, for example, such tanks. So honestly, I think we're stalled here, and that barrier and block has to be opened and changed.
Yeah, just to add a point to what Paula said. I agree with you, Paula, that it is the signal from the leadership in the U.S. that we want this to happen. That would be very important. But there's also one specific thing. The companies are basically maxed out at production that they can do. They're producing at their maximum capacity unless they expand production capacity, which is to build new factories and open new lines of production, which is a substantial initial investment that is then paid off after sales of shells over a period of years. And this is, again, an area where the US government should be providing the assurance to these companies of future procurement for a number of years in order to stack that up against the initial capital cost of expanding the capacity, which would then allow these companies to go get financing at a reasonable rate. So it is stuck a little bit on that of just giving them the assurance that there will be the offtake for a number of years to justify that expense. Some of this has been done. It's not as if it hasn't been done at all, but it is nowhere near the capacity that it should be at.
I was just going to add a 30-second footnote, Herman. I was going to say, I haven't heard that from all companies. I do want to say that. Fair point, but there are some that are ready to move more in and actually have it waiting. And we're surprised at certain caps that have been put on their particular hardware.
Well, I would add one other thing, and that is that the weapons don't have to be manufactured that we would be sending to Ukraine. Though the manufacturing is the ones we're going to replace our stockpile with. And there are several critical weapon systems platforms that are being made right now, but our government has not given permission for those manufacturers to ship them to Ukraine. They're being shipped to other countries that want them, but not to Ukraine. So it really comes down to a policy decision on what our government wants to do.
Okay, we'll give you a comment, opportunity to comment on one fact put forth by a listener who says that of the NATO countries now having 2% of not spending 2% of their budget on defense, the total amount that NATO would have if each of those countries would spend the 2% is less than $1 billion and reasonably insignificant. Does that track with what you know? And if so, why isn't it more widely circulated in response to the recent comment of former President Trump?
Hey, I thought Kurt would jump in, but
Yeah.
all right, I'm going to say I don't know. Factually, I can't say that. But what I can say to the questioner, I do think it's very significant in terms of actually, it's a different issue. I believe it's now 18 of all the countries in NATO have now met the 2%. And by the way, there are also a number of countries that are even over 2%. It's when Radek Sikorski, the foreign minister of Poland, was here, he mentioned that Poland is at 4%. And I believe that there are a few others. So I can't answer your question in terms of the dollar amount that you're asking, but I think that the trend has been a significant one and one which demonstrates that countries have advanced their own defense spending significantly.
Yeah. So I like Paula, I don't know the number. It's actually a good question. If everybody who is not spending 2% raised it to 2%, what would be the total additional amount spent? It's a good question. It'd be nice to have that number. Something that I do know is that when President Trump became president in 2017, 3 NATO countries were spending 2% of GDP on defense. Today, that number is 18. And that includes Germany, which has the largest economy among our allies. So this is a significant change from what the situation previously was. There are still 13 countries that are not spending 2% of GDP. They need to raise their spending. And some of them are in the process of doing that. But it is a far better picture than it was in 2017.
With that, we'll thank the panel and hand everything back to Bob McConnell to continue with the program. And much thanks to Kurt and Paula and Marko, who's left. Signing off.
And on behalf of the foundation, I thank all of you. It's been, I think, a very good discussion. Well, I'm going to take this call while I'm live. Hello, Wes. The panel you were to be on is just concluding, but I'm going to welcome you to the one you're equally ready to talk about with Ukraine, victory for the people of Ukraine, what is needed. General Breedlove, John Herbst, Deborah will be there, and when you log in, you will join that discussion. Greatly appreciated. All right, bye. In answer to your question, Herman, he's aboard, but he's aboard the next discussion. I know, and no problem with that. He's equally and just as well versed for this next one.